Rod Phillips is Ontario's Environment Minister. We're very happy to have him join us from Queen's Park, the provincial legislature in Toronto. Good to have you with us, Mr. Phillips, and thank you for your time today.
My pleasure, Todd. Great to be with you.
What's at stake here for you?
Well, we made a commitment, we made a promise to the people of Ontario that we would use all means possible to fight the imposition of a carbon tax. As you mentioned in your lead-in, we've taken the steps through legislation I introduced this week to get rid of the cap-and-trade carbon tax of the previous government. The motive behind that, of course, is that there's two important facts. We think that the imposition of that kind of tax, of that kind of pressure, particularly a regressive tax on low and middle income Ontarians, is just the wrong thing to do, particularly in this time of economic uncertainty. We also don't see it as an effective tool. We don't see it as something that's going to make the difference on climate change. So for those two reasons, we're focused on this, and today's action by my colleague, the Attorney General, Caroline Mulroney, was another step to use the courts. We're using the Saskatchewan reference as well, and of course make our points in public. We don't think that the Trudeau carbon tax is good for Ontario. We don't think it's good for Canada, and we're going to fight it.
We know that in this whole debate, Mr. Phillips, you can appreciate, the facts and the arguments and the counter-arguments. It all becomes a bit murky and hazy for a lot of people. But when you're talking about the impact on the economy here, the Trudeau government has said, look, we need this sort of thing so Canada can meet our commitments to the Paris Climate Change Accord. This can be done effectively. You would argue that it's going to have a negative impact on the economy, not just of Ontario, but across the country, correct?
That's right. We do agree on the problem. We disagree on the solution. And when I met with Minister McKenna, the federal minister, I urged them not to be so dogmatic, not to assume that the only approach to this was a regressive carbon tax. But here's our worry. And it came up earlier in Ottawa this week with big companies that were talking to the federal government. We need a competitive economy. We can't layer this tax on top of the other taxes and charges and expect our businesses to compete. We saw a bit of a back down, more than a bit of a back down. We saw the beginning of a climb down by the federal government this week where they started to change the rules, where they started to cut deals with big business in terms of reducing the charge on them. And what we're saying is, if it's too expensive for businesses now to compete, we obviously think that's one of the reasons we're against it, but then let's be fair to the rest of Canadians. Let's not charge them a carbon tax either. We need to tackle climate change. We know it's an issue, but we can't afford the hit on the economy. We're really worried, particularly with the turbulence right now in the economy and in our trade relationships. The Ontario economy just doesn't need this.
I want to ask you about the Manitoba example, because we were talking about Ontario and Saskatchewan, Premier Doug Ford, Premier Scott Moe joining forces, but we know that Manitoba did commission legal advice on a similar sort of challenge, and they were basically told that the federal government, as you know, Mr. Phillips, does have the right to impose this sort of tax. So in terms of the effectiveness of this constitutional challenge, what do you think?
Well, we think the Saskatchewan reference is worthwhile. That's why we have participated in that. We also think the Ontario reference is worthwhile, and we have confidence in our position. We have confidence that this is going to be something that the courts are going to want to look at closely. And of course, we can't pre-decide what that's going to be, but we think it is well worth the time and well worth the investment, because this is an important issue for the people of Ontario. It is too expensive right now to do things like fill up your car, drive your kids to hockey, some of the things that we've come to take for granted. And a carbon tax just punishes people for going about their day-to-day lives. We've talked to the Prime Minister. I said to him today through the media, I said, Mr. Prime Minister, our message is just cancel your carbon tax. Work with us on creating the kinds of jobs we want to, but don't make our economy more uncompetitive. And please don't punish low and middle income Ontarians, because this kind of regressive tax does just that.
You mentioned the word dogmatic earlier. Is that what we're seeing, in your opinion, from the Trudeau government when it comes to the environment?
When it comes to this issue, and I can say when I met with Minister McKenna, we did talk about a number of issues, and certainly there are issues we're going to work well on. But on this issue of imposing a carbon tax, their position is, unless you put a carbon tax on, unless you put a price on carbon, then we're going to do it for you. We think that a Made in Ontario solution makes sense. You mentioned Manitoba. Manitoba has a Made in Manitoba solution. Saskatchewan, the same. This isn't a partisan issue. We have Liberal premiers on the East Coast, including PEI, who are saying they are not going to put a price on carbon either. So we'd encourage her to work with the provinces to say, we all want to get to the same objectives. We understand that climate change is an issue. Let's work together on this, and let's not be so stuck on the fact that we have to charge a tax. And particularly, the minister talks about a tax and this being important to our competitiveness. I'm sorry, but that's just not what we're hearing from business. More tax doesn't make us more competitive. It doesn't make people's lives easier.
Rod Phillips is Ontario's Environment Minister. Mr. Phillips, great to have you on CTV with us today and share your opinion on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Todd.